There was one tactic Ukraine used against Crimea that Russia couldn't figure out in time. It wasn't a new weapon or a technological breakthrough. It was a way of forcing an entire air defense system to make bad decisions before the real threat even entered the engagement zone. That night, Russian operators were seeing targets on their screens. They were firing, they were intercepting, and yet they were losing. At 4:16 a.m. local time, over the Black Sea, roughly 60 kilometers from the coast of the Crimean Peninsula, a swarm of Ukrainian drones was flying low. Ahead of them was an airfield, a key strategic air base of the Russian aerospace forces in Crimea, from which Moscow controls the Black Sea and supports military operations in southern Ukraine. But the Ukrainian operators didn't know one thing. After numerous strikes on the peninsula, Russia had deployed a system there that no drone swarm had ever faced before, and the outcome of the entire operation depended on a single decision that had to be made the moment the formation entered Crimean airspace. After 45 minutes of flying through the dark, the lead drone's satellite receiver updated its coordinates. But the new coordinates were false. On the control screen, the system showed the drone approaching a section of coastline. In reality, it was flying in a completely different direction, at an altitude of roughly 75 meters and a speed of about 160 kilometers per hour, heading straight toward the waters of Sevastopol. That's where the most modern and layered air defense system on the entire peninsula was located. In the port area, a Russian electronic warfare station had begun jamming GPS, GLONASS, and GNSS signals while simultaneously broadcasting false coordinates. A deviation of just a few kilometers could push the entire formation out of the attack corridor, away from the target, or send it straight into the Russian air defense zone, which was already on high alert. The drone kept believing it was holding the right course. In reality, it was being nudged off track centimeter by centimeter. But the drone hadn't been designed to blindly trust satellite signals. Inside was an inertial navigation system. It autonomously calculated heading, speed, time, and distance traveled, without relying on satellites at all. Sure, error accumulated. With every kilometer traveled, the deviation could increase slightly. But the airfield was still on the Crimean Peninsula, and that error couldn't compromise the entire operation. It was like already being in the right city and looking for a specific street. There are multiple routes. The key is just not to lose your bearings completely. When the satellite signals started lying, the swarm didn't panic. It kept flying and switched to autonomous mode with artificial intelligence, plotting its own new route. Meanwhile, along the coast near Sevastopol, a Russian air defense officer was sweeping the waters in a radius of roughly 60 kilometers with the beam of his search radar. The signal barely flickered and disappeared. The officer leaned toward the screen. A faint trace reappeared for a few seconds, then faded away, as if it were dissolving into the background noise generated by the surface of the water. It wasn't sharp enough to establish a track, not distinct enough to open fire, but not empty enough to ignore. After 3 years of drone warfare, no Russian officer could afford to write off a signal like that as accidental. A flickering signal on a screen is scarier than a clean target. When the radar is tracking a target with certainty, the operator at least knows where to shoot. When it appears for a fraction of a second and then disappears again, that means something is approaching, and the system can't determine what it is or where it's coming from. All along the defensive line around Sevastopol, other operators were watching screens that weren't empty either. Just faint, intermittent signals appearing on one sweep and vanishing on the next, and each of them was reaching the same alarming conclusion. Something is approaching, and the radar is only catching glimpses of it. The reason became obvious when you looked at the drone itself, gliding over the water. It was a small long-range attack drone, built from composite materials and plywood, worth around $100,000. Ukraine had designed it to make Russian radar doubt its own data. At an altitude of roughly 75 meters above the sea, the drone was concealing itself behind 2 layers of protection at the same time. The first, the constantly churning surface of the Black Sea, which created countless chaotic reflections on the radar screen. The second, the curvature of the Earth. For a target flying that low, a ground-based radar simply couldn't detect it from far away the way it could an aircraft or a high-altitude missile. In theory, the radar could track targets at considerable distances, but only if they were high enough and sharp enough. At that moment, it couldn't reliably track objects even at a few dozen kilometers. The Russian operator was a professional. The problem that morning was that the laws of physics weren't on his side. Then the distance started closing. The curvature of the Earth could no longer fully conceal the swarm. The faint signals rose above the radar horizon. On the screen, the intermittent traces stopped disappearing as quickly. They held longer, grew brighter and sharper with each rotation of the antenna. When the swarm was about 25 kilometers from the coastline, the screen was gradually filling up with blinking dots, skimming the sea like razor blades. Each dot could be a real drone or a decoy. But nobody at the command post dared to write them off as decoys anymore. Then the formation began to split. One group headed toward the airfield, another toward the ferry terminal across the Kerch Strait, the critical logistical artery between Russia and the peninsula. The main group turned toward the airfield, where Russia had concentrated combat aircraft, technical warehouses, and maintenance facilities supporting operations in Crimea, and it was precisely at that moment that the interception system began operating at the edge of its capacity. Each battery had a limited number of fire control channels. Each channel could only track and neutralize one target at a time. Imagine a telephone switchboard with several lines and dozens of calls coming in simultaneously. Any one of them could be real. Any one of them could be fake. With every interceptor missile fired, the ammunition stockpile dropped by one. Behind every cheap drone that got shot down could be a missile costing several times more than the target, but not firing. A single drone getting through could hit the airfield, the ferry terminal, a fuel depot, or a dock. That was the whole plan. All Ukraine had to do was force the interception system to process too many targets at once. When the radar is forced to classify countless signals, when the fire control channels are occupied, when battery commanders have to choose which target to engage first, the air defense system starts to break down. On the S-350's radar screen, the battery commander selected the nearest cluster of signals and ordered them to open fire. The missiles left the launchers almost one after another, leaving white smoke trails behind them that tore through the dawn sky. They accelerated to speeds several times the speed of sound, locked onto intercept trajectories, and dove toward the drones skimming the waves. There was something strange about this confrontation. A modern air defense system, designed to fight cruise missiles and jet aircraft, was now being forced to chase small, cheap targets flying so low they were practically brushing the sea. The first missile exploded in front of the formation. A column of water rose above the Black Sea. The second detonated to the right. The shrapnel skimmed the surface of the water, but not close enough. The third exploded prematurely. The fuse had been fooled by reflections off the waves. The fourth exploded near one of the drones, but it punched through the curtain of water and kept flying. The problem wasn't range. The problem was the target itself. A drone flying over the sea didn't give as clean a radar return as a fighter jet. Its fuselage was small, its radar cross-section minimal. Below it, the constantly churning water was bouncing signals off in thousands of directions. To the radar, the drone's body and the sea blended together into a single blob of noise that was nearly impossible to separate. The missile's fuse was calibrated to recognize larger, sharper, more stable objects. But that morning, it had to distinguish a small glider skimming the water from an entire sea, screaming false signals. It was like an advanced home security system with cameras in every corner, except the intruder turned out to be a mouse running along the baseboard. The system works, the sensors trigger, but everything is calibrated for a threat of a completely different scale. Meanwhile, on the control screen, the situation was getting more and more complex. Low-flying signals were constantly flickering inside the noise band. No target held long enough to form a complete picture. The signals at higher altitudes were sharper and brighter, but many could turn out to be decoys or secondary targets within the formation. That was the whole genius of the Ukrainian tactic. Not every drone needed to fly straight toward a single point. All it took was making the Russian air defense system believe that any direction could be the main one. The moment the formation split, the batteries were forced to split as well. Radars in one sector could no longer easily support the others. The systems around Sevastopol were tied up with the flickering signals over the sea. 8 drones broke off from the decoy group, turned northwest, and began penetrating the peninsula. Their objective was the airfield. Ahead of them stretched the vast steppe plain of Crimea, where Russia had built several layers of air defense, long-range detection radars, electronic warfare stations, surface-to-air missile systems, and small-caliber anti-aircraft guns. Everything was organized to turn the approach to the airfield into a kill corridor. But at that moment, the system was no longer as solid as it looked on the map. Part of the radar network was tied up with the decoys. Part of the fire control channels were already active. Part of the missile stockpile had already been spent intercepting targets that operators couldn't positively identify as fake or real. The 8 drones drove straight into that gap. They were low enough, cheap enough, numerous enough, and persistent enough to force one of the densest air defense systems in Crimea to spread itself thin. And it was only when the main strike turned toward the airfield that the Russians began to understand the real problem. They weren't just fighting drones, they were fighting the way Ukraine was forcing the entire air defense system to make bad decisions before the real target even appeared on the screen. 8 kilometers from the airfield, a Russian Pantsir S-1 was already waiting. 5 minutes earlier, its crew had received alert data from the air defense network, covering the entire peninsula. On the screens, the low-flying targets were advancing exactly along the expected corridor. This time, they were no longer blurry fragments of noise. The radar was starting to lock onto targets. Tracking was becoming more stable, sharper, closer with each passing moment. At this distance, the drone was no longer shielded by the curvature of the Earth. It had entered the zone the pantsir was designed for. The battery commander gave the order. The missiles left the launch tubes almost simultaneously, accelerated to several times the speed of sound, and raced toward the formation, leaving thin smoke trails in the gray sky behind them. The radar held the track. The fire control computer calculated the intercept point. The first missile closed in on the lead drone, the fuse activated at roughly 5 meters from the target. A flash of fire bloomed in the air. The drone disintegrated instantly, its composite fuselage and plywood structure scattered across the steppe. The second drone tried to evade, but at that speed and distance, the reaction came too late. The second missile exploded nearby. The shrapnel punched through the fuselage, destroying the wing and the engine. The drone banked, lost lift, and crashed, leaving a short smoke trail behind it. Within seconds, only 6 of the 8 remained. But it was precisely at that moment that the pantsir itself started running into trouble. Missiles are effective as long as the target is far enough away to be tracked, the trajectory can be calculated, and an intercept is possible. But when the remaining drones accelerated and dropped even lower, the distance closed too fast. The reaction window slammed shut. The firing angle became too acute. The commander switched modes. The 2 30mm autocannons swiveled toward the attack. The targeting system began calculating the lead point ahead of the formation. The pantsir opened fire. The sound tore through the morning like a massive chainsaw. The 2 cannons were spitting thousands of rounds per minute, throwing up a wall of steel in front of the drone formation. Tracers slashed through the air. Bursts of 30mm shells wove a dense curtain of fire between the drones and the airfield. For the Ukrainian operators, the situation became immediately clear. If that wall of fire stayed up, the 6 remaining drones would never reach the airfield. There was no punching through a rain of shells, corrected in real time by radar and optoelectronic sights. A decision had to be made. One drone broke away from the group. It accelerated to maximum speed, nose down, and headed straight for the pantsir's position. The Russian crew noticed the course change too late. The cannons kept firing. The turret was still trying to shift fire back onto the drones, heading for the airfield. The drone crossed the edge of the curtain of fire. Its fuselage shook, pieces of wing tore away, but the engine kept driving it forward. Then it hit the pantsir. The explosion swallowed the firing position. Flames consumed the turret and the launchers. The curtain of fire that, just a moment before, had been tearing through the air above the airfield went out suddenly, as if someone had cut all the power to the defensive system in a single stroke. In the seconds that followed, a gap opened up. The 6 remaining drones instantly accelerated, dropped even lower, and punched through the defensive line before the support forces had time to react. Behind them, smoke from the burning pantsir rose above the steppe. Ahead of them, the airfield was entering the engagement zone. The Russians had no intention of giving up. The moment the report on the pantsir's destruction reached the command post, the airfield's air defense commander understood that the last outer shield protecting the base had been breached. 6 drones were bearing down directly on the runway, the hangars, and the technical area. He grabbed his radio. 2 additional wheeled pantsirs received emergency orders to deploy to the hangar area. But combat vehicles need time to move, deploy, raise the radar, stabilize the turret, and bring the systems into combat-ready position. And that time was something the airfield was almost completely out of. While waiting for reinforcements, the commander ordered everything that could still open fire to engage. 4 Zu-23 mounts inside the airfield opened fire simultaneously. Their 23mm cannons shook as they poured bursts into the incoming drones. Tracers tore through the low sky, creating crossing lines of fire above the airfield perimeter. In the outer ring, security troops hoisted portable anti-drone rifles onto their shoulders. They were trying to jam control signals, cut off communications, and knock the drones off course. The system was attempting to block control channels and navigation signals with directional jamming, but for that kind of defense, it was already too late. The drones were no longer dependent on direct control. Having passed through the jamming and signal spoofing zones, they had switched to autonomous mode with artificial intelligence, plotting their own routes, correcting their trajectories, and guiding themselves toward the target coordinates. Then, the heavy machine guns joined in. The 4-barrel Yak-12.7S swiveled upward. The barrels came alive and opened fire at a rate of up to 4,000 rounds per minute. Dense streams of fire lashed the sky. The noise of the machine guns, the 23mm cannons, the wailing sirens, and the drone engines merged into a chaotic roar, as if the airfield were tearing itself apart from the inside. The soldiers at their posts were no longer waiting for precise orders. They were firing.